in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, allegations of interference in the elections in the occupied areas have fuelled anger among Turkish Cypriots, further compounded by the recent visit of Turkish President Tayip Erdogan to the area.
They shouted, "Ankara, take your hands off us." And they shouted, "We want democracy, we don't want submission."
And the University of Cyprus is leading a study into COVID-19 and in particular who has made antibodies to the virus.
We want to see whether every one of these volunteers who will express interest in participating to the study, whether they have made antibodies against the virus. If they have made antibodies against the virus, that means they came into contact with the virus, they were infected, and they responded.
Well, there's been a lot of uproar in Cyprus over the last week or two with the pending and then carried out visit of Tayip Erdogan of Turkey. He came over, he had promised he'd have a picnic on the beach at the occupied area of Varosha. And if we look back to the last election, when a person that some people might say was Erdogan's puppet, Ersin Tatar, was elected as the new president of the northern part of Cyprus, then, well, we've got a real mix of stuff going on. And who better to join us and unravel some of this story than Turkish Cypriot journalist Esra Aygun. Esra, thanks for joining us. I suppose we have to look at this in the bigger picture of that recent election and the whole way things on the Cyprus problem seem to be developing. So can you sort of give us an idea of what the mood is over there? Because we've had demonstrations against Erdogan's visit and we've had people welcoming him with open arms. What's happening?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for hosting me. The mood in the north is very much polarized. On the one hand, you have a big number of people who are disappointed, angry, and frustrated with what happened with the elections. And we can go into details of that if you want.
Well, yes, can you start by doing that so that we lay the groundwork for people who aren't familiar with the situation? Because that was a sea change in a way, wasn't it? It's a bit like looking at America during the elections. It's 50-50 just about, isn't it?
It is 50-50, just like the almost like the American election. Well, on the one hand, we had Mustafa Akıncı, the pro-solution, pro-federation Turkish Cypriot leader, who did not shy away from raising his voice against Ankara, standing up against Ankara. He has been involved in a number of disagreements and arguments, actually, with the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So, and on the other hand, we had Ersin Tatar, who had proven during his post as head of the governing coalition, had proven that he is willing to do anything that comes from Ankara that is dictated by President Erdogan. So the elections were between these two men. And as you said, there was a lot of, well, I think in the history of Turkish Cypriot politics, there has never been such intervention to such a degree, so openly. We have had interventions by Ankara before. They did meddle in the elections. They did tell certain candidates to, withdraw their candidacy. But it was never this out in the open, without feeling the slightest need to do it in secret. It was done very openly. And in front of everybody's eyes. And as a result of these meddling by Ankara, Ersin Tatar won. When we look at the second round, because we had 2 rounds of elections, so in the first round, 2 candidates received the highest votes, and they went to the runoff, to the second round. We see that almost 20,000 more people went to the ballot boxes in the second round. And these people were from mostly the rural areas, and these people all voted for Ersin Tatar. So you can easily see Erdogan's and Ankara's influence on these people. These people are mostly, people who have settled in Cyprus from Turkey, most of the time, with a low income, dependent, and so very open to being manipulated.
We did hear that there were reports of people actually taking photographs on their phones of their ballots and of money changing hands. Now, can that be proven?
I think it can be proven because, we have the names of the people because they posted this online. So we have the names of the people who took photos of their ballots, and we also, in Cyprus, it's in a very small place. You can easily find out what amount of money was, and negotiated, what these people received. And everybody knows it, and everybody is talking about it. I am a bit disappointed because of the fact that Mr. Akıncı did not seem willing to go after this. He could have asked for an investigation. He could have asked for some police investigation about this, but he seemed, I guess, at the end of a very difficult process, he seemed tired, he seemed disappointed, he didn't seem willing to fight more.
He perhaps thought it wouldn't have done any good anyway. So let's come on to Erdogan's visit. It was really sticking a finger up, particularly at people who have property in Famagusta, and the weather actually thwart his idea of a picnic because it was an absolute storm that day. But nevertheless, he did have a visit. There was a military parade, I believe, to mark the UDI. And what do we do and expect now?
What do we expect now? Well, as you said, at the beginning, the community is completely polarized. So we have 50% that is cheering, or at least not bothered by Erdogan and his policies in Cyprus, and then we have 50% who are very much against it. And there was a very huge protest even before the Varosha visit, and there were thousands of Turkish Cypriots on the streets, and the slogans that they shouted, they were very meaningful. They shouted, "Ankara, take your hands off us," and they shouted, "We want democracy, we don't want submission," and things like this. So their messages were very, very clear. And we also had smaller demonstrations on the day of Erdogan's visit. Yes, Erdogan's Varosha move, as you know, came as it was another way of intervening in the elections. It was days before the election. He invited Ersin Tatar, and together they announced that they were going to open a beachfront and 2 streets in Varosha for a visit. This cannot really be called a Varosha opening until now. It is just opening 2 streets on the beachfront for a visit. But it is clear that the ultimate intention is to open Varosha. And we'll find out about this from Erdogan when he came to Cyprus. And he statement about which gave us clues about what they are aiming to do in Varosha.
And we now have the foreign minister of Cyprus on record as saying that if we don't do something fairly quickly, particularly like try and reach a solution, although since he's never really seemed to be that in favour of a bicommunal federation, it seems strange, but he reckons that within a couple of years Turkey might annex northern Cyprus. Is that what worries Turkish Cypriots as well?
Well, that's something I've been saying for some time now. It is a real threat. It is a real potential development. And yes, I think in a couple of years we will be sitting here, maybe making a podcast and talking about the annexation. It is very possible. I really do hope that the Greek Cypriot leadership understands the gravity of the situation, how serious this is, and I hope they sincerely try to find a negotiated solution together with Turkish Cypriot to this problem. But the problem now is that the Greek Cypriot side may understand the very big need for a solution, but then we have somebody like Ersin Tatar as a Turkish Cypriot leader who will not really negotiate a federation unless he is told to do so by Turkey. And if you have listened to the messages given on the 15th of November when Erdogan was there, both Erdogan and Ersin Tatar were talking about two separate states, a solution between two states, two sovereign states. So we have gone back 50 years. We are back to even more. We are back to the days of partition again. They did not utter the word federation, and the only solution they were referring to were as two-state solutions.
Well, we have to leave it there, but I have to say that if that should come to pass, a two-state solution, that would leave Turkish Cypriots pretty much in limbo, wouldn't it? Because even if it was a separate state, as it were, I mean, now they have one that's not recognised by anybody but Turkey. It's at least, I suppose, a little bit perhaps better than an actual annexation and becoming a province of Turkey, but it would leave the Turkish Cypriots completely out of the European Union, where at least at the moment, I think I'm right in saying, they do have access.
Yes, you're very right. I don't think two separate states and annexation is that different from each other in the Cypriot context. Mr. Mustafa Akıncı also said that when they're referring to two-state solution, they are actually not talking about the Greek Cypriot state and the Turkish Cypriot state, but they are talking about the Republic of Cyprus and the Turkish Republic. So this is basically annexation of the north and to Turkey. And I very much agree with him. It would be the end of the Turkish Cypriot identity, culture, way of life, and take away the fundamental rights and freedoms that they have so far managed to preserve.
It's all very depressing. We have to leave it there. It's very, very depressing. Do keep an eye on this for us, and if there's a need to talk again as things develop, we'd love to talk to you again. But thanks for joining us on this week's programme.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you very much.
Turkish Cypriot journalist Esra Aygun talking to us there about developments in the occupied areas of Cyprus.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Another story that's been in the headlines over the last several days is about slaughterhouses, because the owners of the Cypra and A&A slaughterhouses in Nicosia and some of their workers were arrested during the week as part of checks that were carried out at the facilities. Now, the Cyprus slaughterhouse was the first one that came into the headlines after 92 workers tested positive for the novel coronavirus. When the authorities went to investigate, they found that there were many illegal workers there, and it seems that the owner of the slaughterhouse, who turns out to be the husband of the Republic's Accountant General, has been fined €213,500 because of the 61 undeclared workers found at its premises. There have also been allegations that workers at the facility were living in unhealthy conditions and sleeping very close together in containers. There are also investigations into whether or not these illegal workers are victims of people trafficking.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Earlier this week, at a press conference at the University of Cyprus, there was the launch of a new study into COVID-19. The head researcher is Professor of Genetics at the university, and he is Konstantinos Deltas. So, Konstantinos, what is this study looking at, and what do you hope will be gained from it?
The study is coordinated by the Center of Excellence in Biobanking and Biomedical Research of the University of Cyprus. And collaborators are faculty researchers from the Medical School of the University of Cyprus, the Medical School of the University of Nicosia, and also colleagues from the European University of Cyprus, Department of Health. There are three main aims in this study. Number one is to archive data and biological material from former patients with COVID-19, and from two additional population groups. So number one population group is people who had tested positive for the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. Number two is people who are healthcare workers, like doctors and nurses who have worked or are working in hospitals and they came into contact with people who were positive for COVID-19. And the third group is people of the general population who have not necessarily tested positive for the coronavirus, but perhaps they came into contact and they didn't realize, and therefore they probably generated antibodies against the virus. So the idea is to test people from all these three population groups to see whether they have elicited a response to the coronavirus and they have made antibodies against it.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, there is a specific test. You collect blood and you test for the presence of the virus. No, actually, what you look for is for the presence of antibodies against the virus. Okay, this is what we are asking to see. We want to see whether every one of these volunteers who will express interest in participating to the study, whether they have made antibodies against the virus. If they have made antibodies against the virus, that means they came into contact with the virus, they were infected, and they responded. So we expect that people who had tested positive by the PCR test for the RNA of the coronavirus, we expect them to be positive, at least most of them. But we want to know how many of what these more than 7,000 people who have tested positive for the coronavirus, how many of them have made antibodies and to what extent.
How do you determine whether or not the antibodies that they've got are going to last? Because that's another problem, isn't it? How can you form a time frame?
It's an open question. It's an open question, and we would like to answer it. For example, we expect we are going to have some volunteers who had tested positive a long time ago, several months ago, and we are also going to have volunteers who had tested positive very recently. And we want to see, do both of these groups, earlier affected and more recent affected, do have antibodies against the virus? This is an open question we want to answer.
Right, and can you measure whether or not there is like a fall-off in antibodies? Not being a scientist, I don't really know how it works, but if you've tested positive to having antibodies, can you make a timeline on there saying that, you know, they're high for like 2 months, for example, and then they start to drop off, but they're still there for 6 months and then they disappear? I mean, that's important, isn't it, to know whether or not they will be efficacious in the future?
Well, again, this is one important question. It's probable that they do elicit a response, they do react to the presence of the virus, and they do make antibodies, but you don't know how long they last and how efficient they are, whether they are neutralizing, as we say. So, first of all, we would like to know who of all these people have made antibodies. And then, as I said, while we expect people who have tested positive to have antibodies, we don't know whether healthcare workers who are not aware of having been affected, whether they have made antibodies. And then in the general population, for example, you and I had 2 eyes the test and I was negative. But I don't know, did I probably get in touch sometime during all these 8 months and I reacted and I made antibodies and I don't know it? You see, when you test for the RNA of the virus, this famous PCR test, it's a result you're getting for those few days. Okay, because you get infected, you are positive for the RNA of the virus, and then you're cured in a way. After a couple of weeks, you're not positive any longer to the PCR, but the antibodies may be there. The antibodies may last for months. So the PCR test answers the question whether you are currently, at this very moment, positive for the virus, and with the antibodies, you get the information whether somebody ever came in contact with the virus and elicited an immune response and made antibodies against the virus. So 6 months later, for example, somebody may be negative for the RNA for the virus, but may be positive for the antibodies.
That, I presume, also takes into account asymptomatic people.
Exactly. Somebody may have been infected. He or she remained asymptomatic, no symptoms at all. He didn't even think of having been infected, and yet he may be positive for antibodies. And we would like to know that, if it happens.
Right. What sort of effect can these studies have on the development of vaccines? Because I'm presuming that antibodies, that's all part of the vaccine in a way, is it?
Well, it's not directly relevant. I mean, it's a well-known fact that people do make antibodies through natural course of events. I mean, somebody who gets infected does make antibodies, and this is good. Now, the vaccine, it's a technical way. It's not the natural way of making antibodies. You give to the person the vaccine, which is going to elicit a response. It's not a virus. It's part of the virus that you give to the person, but it's enough, it's adequate to elicit a response to provide the person with the correct antigen, okay? The correct antigen, the epitope, which is going to be seen by the body, and the immune response will generate the antibodies.
Why can't you just inject antibodies into people?
Because you don't have them unless you get antibodies from people who have been infected already. This is what we call convalescent plasma. Convalescent plasma is plasma from people who had been infected already, and they made antibodies against the virus. So you take this plasma from a number of people who had been infected in the past, and you inject it to people who are sick or people who have not come into contact yet in order to protect them. It's not a very efficient way to control the pandemic. A better and more efficient way to make thousands and thousands of vaccines is through the use of technology and laboratories.
And where does Cyprus stand on that? Have you got anybody at the university working on vaccines?
No, I don't think we have in Cyprus the technology and the funding to
Now, the last time we spoke, Konstantinos, we were talking about the Cyprus Biobank, which I presume is where you're going to get a lot of your data from for this, and where you're going to be putting a lot of data in as you proceed with the project. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Exactly. We are going to take advantage of this research infrastructure, the biobank, to collect and archive the data and samples for current and future use. It's an efficient and quality way to follow for collecting data and material of good quality and use it for research.
Is there any indication at all as yet, you're, as we said at the beginning, a professor of genetics, whether there is some sort of genetic fingerprinting going on here that makes some people more at risk of contracting COVID than others?
Yes, this is the other major aim of this project, that we are going to collect DNA from every one of the volunteers and develop DNA studies, and try to associate or correlate the clinical picture of the patient, the clinical response of the patient, to genetic markers which may have a role in determining whether somebody is going to have severe or milder symptoms.
There is already, I think, a suggestion that certain racial groups and indeed some genders are more susceptible than others, certainly to getting very sick.
Well, there are indeed a couple of genetic markers, let's call them biomarkers in the DNA, in our genes, which make people more susceptible to infection or more susceptible to a severe clinical outcome. And this is very important to know. And maybe also there are other genetic biomarkers which probably protect people from getting a severe clinical outcome.
How long is this study going to run for?
Well, to begin with, we have approval by the Cyprus National Bioethics Committee for a certain number of volunteers in the three population groups that I described to you. We have reapplied asking them to increase those numbers. So we would like to do a few thousands altogether in the long run. And hopefully we may, depending on how quickly the people respond, depending on how quickly, especially people who have tested positive in the past, react and come to us, we may have some results, preliminary results, in the first 6 months. But as I said, it all depends on how quickly people will come to us and express interest to participate in the study.
So I presume that you would like anybody who has tested positive to get in touch with you, and how should they go about doing that?
Well, we gave already, and I'm giving you here if you wish. The phone number of our center is 22 89 28 15. 892815, and they can call and ask for an appointment. They can also visit our website, which is biobank.cy, and there's a pop-up box which asks them to give their personal details, and we will get in touch with them and arrange an appointment for them to visit us.
Now, of course, the university is based in Nicosia, and you can't go and collect samples from people in the west of the island at the moment with their lockdown. So, presumably, you would over time like to have people from across the island?
We will. We are interested in having people from the entire island, and when enough people express interest from other cities, we will arrange for specific days and invite them to come to specific places in Limassol, for example, or in Paphos, and get permission to go there and sample them.
So give us that number once again.
The phone number is 22 89 2815.
That's the number to call if you'd like to get in touch with this project. And Professor Konstantinos Deltas is heading it along with some other experts. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed as well.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.